So, to set up how you would want to brush a texture or overlay it onto another character's texture, or just any kind of pattern really where you want a more intricate design, there's a few different ways you can handle it, and they require a understanding of a few concepts within Blender, but they're not too complicated as long as you get the basics. What I'm going to do is I have the UV map for Potemkin over here. I'll just turn off the transparency in this tab so it's a bit easier to see. And then I'm going to make a mix color node. This lets me choose between two different outputs based on a value. So if I put an image texture here, I can make a new texture. Let's call it something generic. 2048 by 2048, because that's what the game uses. You can make this higher resolution if you want to make your mod high resolution. That's perfectly fine. Do like 4096, another power of 2. However, it makes the game lag a little bit when it's loading in my experience, but it's not too bad. If you jump up like by 1 because you want finer detail, it'll work perfectly fine. So, now that I've done that, I can drag color into here and alpha into here. And then I'm going to replace the output shader node of that. I'm changing it from base to this. And I'm going to change the SSS to just to make my life easier. If you want more accurate colors to what the SSS would look like, you can instead plug in a quick hue saturation value and just mess with the values a bit. Like, you know, darken it, whatever, turn the saturation. This is something you'd usually end up doing in Photoshop anyway, so I don't tend to do it, but you can. But either way, I'm going to plug these both into the base and SSS. Now that I've done that, I have a pretty nice view of what this model looks like. So, there's two different things I can do here. If I go up here, I'm going to try texture paint mode first. If I go up here into texture, I'm going to make a new texture. And this is what Blender calls the object that is being used as a brush. You need to plug in the image for it over here instead. I'm going to open that. I'm just going to put in the axle pattern, just because, why not? And there's a few different ways you can interact with this. View plane means that, I'll just make it really big over here. View plane means that it'll, good lord, there we go. It'll be based off the way you're viewing it. However, you probably don't want to do that. I would recommend tiled. It'll still be used from the view, however, now that it's tiled, you can see that it gets to be drawn on a lot more accurately. And you can see that it's outputting up here into this new texture I made that's completely empty, and you can view every single little bit. This is really helpful because you can draw certain details onto your model. Like, even if I wanted to, let's say I wanted to make a mod wherein I wanted to make just these white for some reason. I would normally have a pretty hard time doing that because the UVs are like, you know, UVs can be completely weird and broken and all across the model. However, if I'm just selecting them in Blender, I can go into Texture Paint. I can hit this button here to only paint on these. And now, if I get rid of this texture here, there we go. I can only paint onto those, and now I can use that as a thing in Photoshop to do further work with, like a mask. Which is pretty helpful. Or, I can go into here, change this to stencil, load up the texture I made earlier, and now, there's going to be little, like, pop-ups at the bottom left to tell you what your controls that you need to use are, like shift and right-click changes the size, control and right-click rotates it, right-click moves it, but once you've done that, you can draw on using a stencil, which is pretty helpful. This is nice, but when you're like starting with Axel's texture, it'd be pretty cool, but you might want a little bit more granularity, you might want it to be a bit more realistic. So, instead of doing that, this is a bit more involved, and you need to set it up a bit differently, but it's pretty helpful. I'm going to make a new UV map. I'll delete this later, I just need it for now. And I'm going to look at it. This is what Potemkin looks like right now. Now, I'm going to get rid of this little factor node here, just by holding, what is it, Control, and then right-clicking to cut the links. And I'm going to add another new node in here that is the texture. I've also got Axel's pattern, just a big bit bigger. It looks like this. It looks perfectly the same. I'm going to open this up and use this as the base color instead of the character's actual base. This is weird, but you'll see what I'm doing in a second. Now, I want to only select these bits. Let's say I only want a texture's arm. I'm going to first actually go back because I want to look at what he looks like. And go over here and just change the camera to look at this texture instead. Move this back to the left. This changes what texture you're looking at. That's why I cut it off. And I'm going to select, just a bunch of these and see where they are on the texture. Hitting 3 to change to face mode here. I'm hitting what would normally be the keybind L. It's called Select Linked. You can see that down there, but I've changed it to a mouse button for easier use. And now that I've done that, I'm going to look at it on a Potemkin's base texture. And these are all over here. So if I only want to do the right arm, I'm first going to hit this little button to look at the entire texture like this, where it's like actually displaying what parts... It's displaying unselected parts of the UV map. Now that I'm just going to select all of these and then look at it in here, so I can look at just the parts that are colored like his shirt. Which is a bit of a pain, but you get better at it. I'm holding shift to select different parts of it and then do that. Now, Control-I, invert the selection, hit H to hide all of these. Now I'm only looking at his shirt, which is pretty helpful. This is holding Alt and then a middle click dragging, so you can change what your perspective view is. You can also do that using the numpad. I'm going to go into X-ray mode. It's this little button up here. Select all the parts that are easy, and then I'm going to get a bit more refined with it and just select the parts that make up this sleeve specifically. So something like, I'm going to go into lasso mode just to make this a bit easier on myself. Do that, do that, do that. Cool. Now that that's done, I have just the arm selected. Now this is what I mean by it's going to take a bit more Blender experience to understand what I'm doing here, so I'm going to try to make it as simple as I can. I'm going to go into this UV map. This is the one I want to edit, and it's completely default, so everything's going to be weird and all around and such. I'm going to unwrap, hitting U, by a cylinder projection. This looks super screwed up and weird. So I'm going to scale to bounds, which means that it's going to fit within the texture. And I'm going to change a line to polar ZY because I'm looking at it from the side axis. This doesn't seem like I'm doing much right now, but if I go into here, change the UV map I'm looking at to this new one, and then I go into here, and I set this to the axle pattern, and I'm going to turn off the ILM's alpha because it's annoying me. That looks pretty good. And if I want to make the detail better, scale it up, and it looks exactly like I'd want it to. I can mess with the UV all I want. I can scale it vertically if I want to make the pattern a bit more seamless, anything like that. Now that I've done that, I need to bake it. So I'm going to go into here. This is the rendering area. You need to change to cycles because you need the ray tracing mode. I'd recommend changing your device to the GPU, just because in preferences here, you can see that, you also just want to do this in general for Blender if you're using the GPU to render. You have to look at what the render settings do, but it's usually HIP for AMD graphics cards, and then CUDA for NVIDIA ones, as far as I know. But, with all that explaining out of the way, now that I've done this, I'm going to select UV0, I'm going to select the new map, the one that I'm not using at all, but I'm not going to change the one I'm looking at. And if I go into here, and I go into Bake, this tab right here, and I change this to Emit, because right now the way the Arcsys shader works is it's emitting this light, and I target Image Textures, and I hit Bake. It'll take a sec to do that all down here, but once that's done, it's going to switch the texture. And if I go up here, and I go to New Map, you might see that it has now mapped the UV mapping I've done to this texture, which, if I then switch the UVs back to this, and I look at the new map, I now have the textures I was working on mapped to the game's UV map, so I don't need to do any model editing, but it looks exactly like I would want it to if I were to UV map it manually. This is really helpful. It took me about 10 minutes to explain, but I hope this is, useful to somebody. Cool.